All right, so for today's activity, we're going to do something that I personally enjoy. I will say that I've pared this activity down quite a bit. So if you find it boring and tedious, I just want to let you know it was far more boring and tedious in previous years. All right. It basically in the past, this was actually a two-part activity where I had students do the mapping initially, and then they had to use that mapping to prepare macros. I actually have done the mapping for you all, so you don't have to worry about doing all that. So basically what we're going to be talking about today is doing macros in Excel. And you may be familiar with some of it. You may be much more sophisticated than the stuff we're going to be doing today. But macros are tools that are used in a lot of different data programs. Excel is probably the one that's most well known. But basically all a macro is that if you have a repetitive task that follows a similar or same format, you can use a macro to repeat that format every single time. And I will say that the ones that we're going to be learning today, they're very, very basic. We're not going to go too much further past that because I will first of all say I am not an expert in macros. The amount that I know about macros, pretty much I'm going to show you today. All right, that's kind of the extent of it. It's not particularly difficult to do what I'm going to do today. It does require an attention to detail. So really, really important that you're paying attention throughout, especially when I say, hey, make sure you pay attention and note this step. Because if you don't pay attention and note this step, then you're going to miss something really important. Then you're going to come ask me, why is this work, Dr. Barnes? And I said, remember why I said pay attention and note this step? You obviously didn't pay attention and note this step, okay? So, but there are ways with macros to actually expand upon the capabilities. We actually used a pretty sophisticated macro when I did data analysis back at KPMG because that was the visualization tool that we had at the time. I know you're saying, Dr. Barnes, Excel is not a visualization tool. It's just, well, yeah, this is back in before Tableau and Power BI were available. So we did all of our work and ideas and exported the file to Excel, and then we ran macro in Excel, which was a lot more dynamic than what we're going to do now. And I can only imagine it took hundreds of hours, whoever wrote that macro to put that together. It was a work of art. It was pretty impressive. Yours is not going to take hundreds of hours. It may take you hours of hours. That's about it. But there are some things that I think are really important to note. And as we're going through this, I'm going to try to give you some information that will help you save some time and some frustration. This has actually been honed over about a period of 5 years. I've learned from some mistakes that I've given in instructions. So again, if I tell you something that I think is really important, please make a note of it because I do think this is important. On a related note, as we're kind of doing this introduction, I will encourage you that if you have some sort of alternate device, whether that be a phone, smartphone, a laptop, a tablet, some sort of device that you can display additional content on, you might want to have that available to you. The reason for that is because you won't be able to click between files on your computer, or at least you shouldn't be able to. You shouldn't click between files on your computer, and I'll explain why when we get to that. So as you start working on your macro, then you may want to actually have a display handy of what the output should look like so that you can actually replicate that properly, but you will not want to have that on your main computer. Anyway, what is a macro? So as I said, a macro before is just basically a tool that we use to replicate a task. And if you know that it's going to follow a similar same format, you can just basically use this repetition function over and over again. And so the tool that I actually used for this, the very first time I taught it was a lot more complex and tedious. But then I realized, you know what, I teach in 221, and I remember that some of the problems from 221, they were basically identical in format with just changes in numbers. And so those of you who took 221, you probably remember the textbook that we're using, the Horngren textbook, that they had those problems that were the same. So I said, let's just use that. And so that is basically what this the macro is going to be using. So you may recognize this. Hopefully those of you who took me for 221 do recognize this because this is actually a problem we did in 221. These were those Excel problems that I said, you're going to have to do this in Excel, get used to it. So for those of you who took me for 221, you're a step above, or a step ahead of everybody else. Rhetorically speaking, you know, I'm not saying that you are actually literally ahead of everybody else. But you know, this is a long assignment where you took some data and you had to actually put this into files and answer different parts of the question. Now, I know that 221 is a long ways away. I know you're taking managerial seminar, but Dr. Otero probably is not teaching you information at this remedial level anymore. So basically what I decided to do is that I said, well, let's just go, I'm going to give you the solutions and you're just going to have to replicate the solution. But it's not so easy as just typing everything out and saying, all right, well, I'm just going to put it together. This is what we call a dynamic macro. And the idea is that it should respond to whatever the input is going to be. And so in doing so, we can actually alter the input. Now, you can kind of see that the spreadsheet that I set up, if you've got these files open, these are actually the files that were on Brightspace. You can see both these files are set up in a similar way. So I've got hard key information here in the trial balance, hard-coded information. This is the trial balance that was just copied from this problem itself in 221. And then I got journal entries that I created based on the problems that were there. So you don't actually have to answer the problems. You don't have to actually go through the answers, go through the answer to the problem. This is not a question of whether or not you can remember how to answer questions from a sophomore course. Rather, I want to use this to show you how to replicate that information. So these two tabs right here are hard-coded information. I basically manually input the numbers, which means that everything else in the spreadsheet should adapt if I change those numbers. So let's just use a very simple example. The first part's a T account. By the way, you thought you got away from T accounts. Those of you who hate T accounts, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to cause trauma to you all, but yeah, T accounts are back. So this information right here is either going to be a piece of information from one of the previous two tabs or a calculated piece of information. So you'll notice in the first T account, I've got my beginning balance. This actually comes from my trial balance right here. And then these transactions here come from the journal entries, and they're coded according to the journal entries. They say D or E, depending on the journal entry. And then the ending balance is just a function of that. Now, it's not an adaptive function, so we're not going to get that complex. Basically, when I say adaptive function, it's like if I change the number of inputs, it would change the equation. This is going to be, when I say it's going to be a very specific format, it is a very specific format. But it is somewhat adaptive in the fact that we can change the inputs and should change the information. So let's just do that. So you will notice here that in this beginning balance of 6,000, we refer back to the June 1st trial balance. So if we click back in the June 1st trial balance tab, and I'm just going to change raw materials to 5,500, which is going to throw everything out of disarray, but I just want to illustrate that this was updated to 5,500, which I know I've not done anything profound. It's like, Dr. Barnes, we know how to link information between tables. That's great, but you have to do that for all pieces of information. So you'll notice when I do that, all of the information in all the tables is now adjusted because of that. And some of it doesn't make sense. Like when we actually do the adjusted trial balance, it's now out of balance because I changed it by $500. And the numbers in the cost of goods manufactured and income statement all change as well. So everything together is a function of either an equation in the tabs or this information right here. So I'm going to change this back to 6,000 just so I don't keep going with the wrong piece of information. What your goal is going to be is you're going to actually do the creation of these 4 tabs. And while you're doing it, you're going to be recording macros. And a macro, like I said, is just simply recording the tasks that you're going to be performing. And if you do this, basically that means that if you change the inputs, you can change the entire source of information that you're going to be creating the inputs on. So we're going to do a very simple example. Now, this first part's really important. I'm going to go through it very slow. And again, it's remedial. If you kind of blank out for a second and say, oh, Dr. Barnes, his voice is kind of droning on and I'm just not really digging, I'm just going to fall asleep. Try not to fall asleep, at least during this part, okay? Because there are going to be a few things that are really important that, again, if you miss them, if you don't take notes on them, if you don't pick up on them, you're going to ask me a question about it later. I'm going to say, yeah, I'm going to use that exact term. Yeah. So let's go ahead and let's just do a very basic macro. So the very first thing I want you to do is I want you to just go ahead and open a blank workbook. That's what I want you to do. That's what I want my computer to do too. Okay, there we go. So in order to be able to set this up, we need to do a few things. First of all, we need to actually have the tool for macros. So the macro tool should be in the toolbar up here. It should be in a tab called Developer. Now, many of you may not actually have that. Some of you may, some of you may not. If you do not, what you're going to want to do is you're going to go to File, Options, and then you're going to say Customize Ribbon. And you'll notice that there's a Developer tab right there that we can add to that. So we can click on that box and click OK. And now we have a new ribbon here. And you'll notice it has information about macros here. So that's kind of our first step. Now I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to kind of set the stage for how we're going to set up this macro. And I'm going to throw a few disclaimers out there. So let's just go ahead. What I'd like for you to do is I'd like you to go to I'm going to close this second assignment. I'm going to open the first one. So this is the, technically speaking, you could do it with either one, but I'm going to be using the problem 1732A. All right. What I'd like for you to do is I'd like you to copy the June 1st trial balance and the Part 1 transaction journal entries. I'd like you to right click on those. And we're going to copy those over to our new workbook. All we're doing is we're taking that, we're putting it into the new workbook. And here are a few important steps. All right. First and foremost, close problem 1732A. Now, I know that's the source of information, and you're going to say, I'm going to use that to check my answer, Dr. Barnes. Well, for the first part, you won't need to, because I'm going to walk you through it. I'm going to show you exactly what you should be inputting. But as you're working on your macro, one thing you will need to note is you do not want to have, this is really important, by the way, this is the most important thing I'm going to say today, by the way. You do not want to have your Excel files open on the same computer that you're writing the macro, the ones that you're checking against. So the reason why is if I use the 1732A and I said, all right, I'm going to be writing my macro and I'm going to be checking against this T account every single time. I'm going to be going from this spreadsheet back over to this spreadsheet and checking to make sure I have the correct answer. A macro will record every single task that you perform in Excel. And I literally mean every single task. So if you've got another spreadsheet open in our check, clicking back and forth on that to check work, your macro will say, oh, this particular spreadsheet has to be open, and I've got to refer back to this every single time I perform a task. So when you run the macro in the future, you have to have that spreadsheet open in order for the macro to work, which defeats the purpose of having it open in the first place, or having the macro, recording the macro in the first place. So again, do not have this macro, do not have the spreadsheet open. Instead, we're going to try to use the macro from a basic level. So we're going to do a few things to set everything up, all right? First of all, what I want you to do is, if you got a sheet 1, we're going to close it out. We're going to delete that sheet 1. We just want to have June 1st trial balance and the Part 1 transaction journal entries. And the very first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and save this file. And we're going to save this. It doesn't really matter what you name it, but you do need to save as. I'm going to browse. I'm just going to save this on my desktop. But the very first thing you need to do before you ever change the name is I want you to go to the save as type, and I want you to change it to .xlsm, which you will notice it says Excel macro enabled workbook. You can't record macros and save them unless you have your Excel files macro enabled. And Excel has this specifically set up for a certain file type because it's going to basically scrutinize that file a lot more. Macros are kind of a dangerous way to transfer information for some machines because they can carry viruses or harmful data. So that's why they set up a separate file type so they can actually check that information to make sure there's nothing hazardous. That being said, we're not going to do anything volatile or anything bad. I'm not going to teach you how to write viruses. It's just we need to set it up as a different file type. So .xslm, and I'm just going to say, I'm just going to call this macro example. Now be sure to note where you save this. You save this on your Y drive or you save this on your desktop, just make sure you know where it is. Because the very next step is going to be completely and totally non-intuitive. After we save the file, we're going to close it. And then we're going to reopen it. Now, there's a very specific reason why I do this procedure. Because when we start writing the macro, we wanted to start on the very first sheet. We want to start on sheet 1. If I were to start writing the macro now, it's going to say there have been 2 sheets created already, plus a third sheet, because we had the first sheet that was created when we opened the blank workbook. So it will probably start on sheet 4, which means that every single time we run the macro, we have to actually start with sheet 4. Otherwise, it's going to reach an error. So the easiest way to default to this is just close it, open it back up, and then every single one of our macros should start from sheet 1. We move forward. So let's go ahead and check that. We're going to click on the plus sign to create a new sheet. Oops, hold on. Yeah. I told you to do that, and then I realized that that's a bad idea. Let's just go ahead and check it, but we're going to have to back out for a second. Okay, so that's what we're trying to get to. Now, the reason I just realized that the problem is that we want to be recording the macro when we do that, so we're going to have to close out again. So I know. Don't save. Just open it back up again. But we're confident now that we're going to start at sheet 1. All right, so here we go. We're going to write a very basic macro for a few of the starting T accounts. Now, basically, all we're going to be doing is to make sure that we can replicate whatever it is that we're trying to set up. So let's just go ahead. We're going to go to Developer. We're going to click on Record Macro. And we're just going to name this. And it doesn't really matter what you name this. One thing I will advise you, when you start recording your macros for your actual assignment, I would encourage your first macro to start with the letter A, second macro to start with the letter B, second macro to C. I would say start them with numbers, but you can't actually begin Visual Basic Code with numbers. It will error out. So that's why I say that you record it. That way you know exactly the sequence that you're going to run in. When I show you my example macros here in just a second, you're going to see that I have to run them in a weird sequence because I put them out. They organize them alphabetically, and so the very last macro is the first one I have to run. So let's just go ahead and I'm going to say example macro. Actually, I said that we need to actually underscore because it's old code. It's Visual Basic, so you can't put spaces in there. You actually have to put underscores in there, and we'll just leave it in this workbook. Once you've got your macro name, whatever it may be, click OK. And at this point right now, Excel is recording everything that we do in Excel. So if you've got another Excel workbook open, if you've got something that you do in Excel kind of ancillary to this, the macro code is going to pick this up. This is where you have to be cautious. This is where you have to be careful. All right, so again, first thing I want to do is I want to create a new worksheet. Yes?
Maybe mine, this is starts with a letter or an underscore. But I get that.
Hold on a second. All right, so what we're doing right now is anytime that you run a task in Excel, this is true whether you're recording a macro or not. Anytime you run a task in Excel, basically there's a back-end code that is running. It's called Visual Basic. And you do something like you say, I type in a formula into a cell, there basically creates a line of code within Excel saying this is what's happening in the spreadsheet. We're actually going to do that. We're just going to run functions in Excel, but we're going to actually save this code that is created so that we can reuse this code over and over again. So the steps are really important to make sure you get them correct and that you don't add anything that's unnecessary. And again, this may be an exercise in frustration. I apologize. I will give you some example or some advice on how to avoid the frustration. So let's go ahead and click on the plus right here to add a new worksheet. All right. I'm going to move this new worksheet to the end just because I'm OCD that way. And I'm just going to rename this. Let's just call it Part 2 T Accounts. Okay. Now you can coordinate this according to however you want to do it, but I've done this a few times, so I know that basically what I want to set up is I always like to have my first column, usually about 3, the width of 3. Then I'm going to make this column width of 5. And again, these are all optional steps, but this is all something that's going to be recorded by the macro. I'm going to do the same thing over here, make this a width of 5. And let's see, make these widths of 15 each. Anybody else feel like they just absolutely have to have exactly on zeros every single time? It's just, yeah, it's one of my frustrations. I'm going to copy those over, so I'm going to create 2 series of columns this way. All right, so what are we going to do? Well, I'm just going to create a couple of the T accounts that we have set up already. So first one is raw materials inventory. And I know that I'm going to start out with the beginning balance. I'm going to refer to journal entry D. I'm going to have an ending balance. I'm going to refer to journal entry E. Let's just go ahead and do some formatting to get this all set up. Now, again, there's no specified format that you have to do. So you see me doing something, you're just like, I'm not sure how to do that. Not a big deal. However I'm doing it is not the required way that you have to do this. This is just kind of how I prefer to it. Okay. So raw materials inventory. Remember, beginning balance is a function of the beginning balance and the trial balance. So I'm going to say equals C10 over in the June 1st trial balance worksheet. Then I'm going to limit to raw materials inventory in my transaction journal entries. So you'll see the debits raw materials inventory right here in journal entry D. And I've also got a credits raw materials inventory in transaction E. I'm just going to create a quick equation to balance everything out. You all know how T accounts work. Debits minus credits. I'm going to go ahead and create another one. If you're still working on this one, it's fine. Just go ahead and finish the first one. I'm just going to create another one real quick since to show how everything works together. Create a cash one. That follows the same protocol. Cash beginning balance comes from the trial balance. And then each of the numbers, the debits and credits, come from the journal entries respective. All right. So if you're able to get through both T accounts, great. If not, if you only got the first T account, that's fine. This is just an example. But once you get at least through the first T account, let's just go ahead and go back to our macro and click on stop recording. Now, the ultimate goal here is not that we put this information in, but can we replicate it using our macro? So let's just go ahead and let's run a test of it. Let's make sure that we can replicate this information. We can replicate the detail. So we're going to do kind of the same thing we did before. What I want you to do is I want you to take these first two tabs, and we're just going to copy them over to a new workbook. And once again, as non-intuitive as it sounds, we're going to save and close. We don't need to save this one as a macro-enabled workbook. We've already saved our macro in a different workbook. The whole purpose of saving in a workbook is so we can use it on other workbooks, but not all the workbooks have to be macro-enabled. Just the one that contains the macro. Sure. So you can right-click, move or copy, and then click on create copy. Just move it to where you want to move it. So save this again.
I'm sorry, I can't see. I forgot.
Okay, hang on a second. Okay, so once you've saved those two tabs into a workbook, save that workbook, close it, open it back up, and here comes our ultimate test. Now, something you will notice, we need to be on the workbook that we just created, but you do need to have your macro workbook open. Okay, so the macro example workbook should be open, but we're going to be on the workbook that's just got these two tabs. So we click on developer, and this time we're going to click on macros, not record macro, but on macros itself. And we should have a macro recorded listed there. And that's actually referring back to the other workbook saying, hey, you've got a macro in this workbook that's open. Would you like to use that macro? And the answer is yes, we'd like to use that macro. So let's make sure that it runs properly. I'm crossing my fingers to make sure I did everything correctly. There we go. Just an easy replication like that.
Security settings,
Securities.
that macros have been disabled.
Oh, that's not good. Hold on a second. I was worried that might happen.
It says reopen the workbook and choose to enable that.
So that was pretty basic, but we can go further. So let me show you what you all will be doing for your assignment. All right. So first of all, make sure whenever you run, or you want to run your macros, that you actually have enable the macro content, which is a security warning, says macro is disabled. You may actually have one or two different problems. If this comes up, you're fine. All you have to do is click on enable content. If you get a pink ribbon that says macros cannot be run because of a security concern, that's more of a Truman State initiative to try to prevent security. That means that there's a problem. If that comes up, contact me. I was a little bit worried about it coming up, but it doesn't appear that that's happening. But the week is still young. So let's just go ahead. I'm going to click on enable content, and I'm going to make this a trusted document because I trust myself. All right. So let's just go ahead and run the macro test. And this is on a file. Now, the reason I ran it on a separate file is that I did some formatting notes. You will notice that in this new file, I don't have the banner up here that kind of shows the explanation for the problem in here, which is why I have a different file open. That's the only reason I decided to open separate files, because I have this macro created on this data. But what happens when we run the macro? Well, let's go ahead and check it out. All right. I've got 4 macros. I would encourage you when you're doing this assignment to use multiple macros. At minimum 4, because there are going to be 4 tabs that you have to recreate. You may want to create more, because if you get like one column through the T accounts and like, okay, I know I've got this correct, I don't want to lose this, you may want to stop recording so that you can move forward. The initial time we did this, I had them record this entirely in a single macro, which means that if there was one error, that either you had to debug that error, which again, is really hard to do because it's written in Visual Basic, or they had to start all the way back at the beginning, okay? That was a really unfortunate situation. I learned from that mistake. So again, use as many macros as you feel you need. Keep them sequential. You will notice here that I did not follow my own advice, that I've got T accounts listed last year, which is the very first macro to run, which is why I told you start with A_T account being the way you want to format the macro, because it does list them alphabetically. But let's just see what it's capable of. Did you have a question?
Yes. So if we like do the first macro and we do it for T accounts, and then we stop and we finish that macro, do we need to check that macro to make sure it runs properly before we move on to the next one?
I would encourage you to, because keep in mind that the macros, since they are sequential, they are going to build off of the data that you're going to be building in the previous macros. So like this T accounts macro, if this doesn't run properly, then my next macro will not run properly because it relies on the data from that macro.
And when I stop the macro recording, I'm like good to move around it.
Absolutely.
But when I first open the Excel, I need to be don't do anything.
Yeah, so keep in mind that whenever you're recording a macro, that the macro will record anything that you do in Excel. And I legitimately mean anything, because anytime you take an action in Excel, it records a line of code. So the macro is going to record that, which is again the reason why I recommend that you have the data open on a tablet or some other external device, because you don't want to be switching between my example file and the file that I'm recording, because it will require you to have that example file open every time you run that macro. But again, if you run it all properly, you should be able to create this within a matter of seconds. So I created that in about 2 minutes, and that was because we were talking what's going on. So, and here's the great part. Here's going to be the test of this. All right. So that's on the original data. Remember that the reason I decided to do this particular assignment is because when you have 2 problems that are formatted identically with different numbers, you should be able to replicate that with a different set of data. So that's basically what your second data set is. So I've got this macro test 2. And in this macro test 2, basically it's the same format, identical sets of journal entries, identical T accounts. It's just different numbers. So I should be able to create the macro on one set of data and then run it on a separate set of data. And I ran this a little bit earlier today. I think you check this, you'll notice that my numbers are identical to the ones that are in the example files that I gave you. Something I'm very proud of. Deserve a PhD for that. Yes. All right. That's really all there is to it. Now, obviously, there's a lot of work that goes behind that, a lot of fine tuning. I'm going to kind of give you some information on this, some suggestions. Okay, like I said, first and foremost, be very, very conscious of everything that you're doing. I know it's very easy to get bored and kind of just want to, do things half-hearted. Anytime you're recording a macro, make sure that your full attention, that you're taking care of that right away. Because if you slip and start doing something else, the macro is probably not going to work well. Also, some of you may get frustrated with this macro exercise. I will tell you that right now. It may require you doing more than just 4 macros. You may have to record multiple more than that. Again, the whole goal here is to exercise an understanding of the process. Okay. There are some things that you can figure out, like there should be some pretty easy keys. Like when we were looking earlier, or working why a macro didn't run. Some explanations are pretty straightforward. Like for example, if you get a debug error and you look up and it says, I can't find sheet 1. Basically, all that's telling you is that when you open your spreadsheet or open your worksheet to run the macro, you did not close it and then save it, or save it and close it and then reopen it. And then it's trying to start from sheet 3 or sheet 4 or whatever that is. So some of these explanations I can actually answer for you. Some of these I may come back to you and says, it looks like you needed to restart your macro. And I apologize in advance. I wish everybody could do this assignment in 4 macros and be done with it. But this is an exercise that you may have to actually spend some time on. So speaking of time, we've only got 7 minutes. So usually I'll let you guys experiment around, and you're welcome to if you want to stick around and do that. But I'm going to call that the end of class. So I'll see you all on Monday.
What if you copy things?
You should